All right, kiddos. So I'm not going to read you all of chapter 21 because it's long and it's my weekend and I'm not going to do it. So I am going to give you the notes for chapter 21. You hear my son in the background. This is why I'm not doing the full chapter. All right. So first things first, in chapter 21 on the first page, Jane says presentiments are strange things. You need to make note of the fact that presentiments, it's like an intuitive feeling, especially when a foreboding. So she's saying that she's having a bad feeling about something that's going to happen. And then we know that for those of us who have the black and white book, that John dies on page 223, which I think we all agree is like not that bad of a thing. He died in his chambers. We know that and it says he gave himself a shock, but we know that he was a gambler and he wasn't taking very good care of himself. So let's be real about that for a second. We know that his lifestyle is probably what led to his death. What's important to understand is that on 224 in the black and white book, Mrs. Reed asks to see Jane on her deathbed because she suffered a stroke as a result of John's death. And what is so strange is that Robert has come to fetch Jane, and we think that Mrs. Reed absolutely freaking hates Jane. So why would she want to see her on her deathbed? It doesn't make a lot of sense to us. So then, on page 225, Jane goes up to Mr. Rochester, and what I want you to make note of is in this part right here, this second paragraph, it says, Miss Ingram notices Jane and says, "Does that person want to speak to you?" It's another time to make note of the fact that Miss Ingram is incredibly classist, and she treats Jane like she's not even a real person. Hey, dude. You gonna help me? Come here. You gonna help me talk to the kiddos? All right, Luke is here to give you some textual analysis of Jane Eyre. Say hi, Bubba. All right, so we get the idea on 225 that Mr. Rochester is asking Jane, why would you go back to somebody who was horrible to you? Why? Who cares? You know, just let her die. And he even says on 226 in this first paragraph, he says, "And what good can you do her? Nonsense, Jane. I would never think of running 100 miles to see an old lady who will perhaps be dead before you reach her. Besides, you say that she cast you off. Yes, sir, but that is long ago, and when her circumstances were very different. I could not be easy to neglect her wishes now." You need to make note of the fact that this is a sign of coming of age. Jane is growing as a person and as an adult, and is showing that she has the capacity to forgive Mrs. Reed. Stop. Let's see. Let go of my mouse. Stop that. Oh, here are my sunglasses. There you go. There you go. And then on page 227, there's this interesting back and forth between Jane and Mr. Rochester. And she's asking for her wages so that she can book passage to go back to Gateshead and then come back to Thornfield. And there's this kind of cute, like, give me my money. He's like, here, let me give you extra. And she's like, no, I only need what you've given me. And he said, well, give me half of it back to entice you to come back. Because you can tell that he's a little freaked out that she's leaving. He's afraid that if he gives her too much money, she won't come back. So that's another thing. On page 229, please make note, this is another coming of age moment. It's this last paragraph right here, the bottom paragraph. And it says, I had left a hostile roof with a desperate and embittered heart. A sense of outlawry had almost the reprobation to seek the chilly harborage of Lowood, that bourne so far away and unexplored. That same hostile roof now again rose before me. My prospects were doubtful yet, and I had yet an aching heart. I still felt as a wanderer on the face of the earth, but I experienced firmer trust in myself and my own power. Stop it. And less withering dread of oppression. The gaping wounds of my wrongs, too, was now quite healed, and the flame of resentment extinguished. What's really important is that whole part where she's talking about how her wounds have healed and her resentment has burned out. That shows full coming of age. There's a little bit of Helen Burns in her there. but there's also a lot more adults than there was before. You look really cool, dude. On 231, she's talking, and we get the idea that her cousins Georgiana and Eliza are kind of horrible people. They really don't care that their mother is dying. All they do is squabble with each other. Eliza thinks that Georgiana is kind of a bad person. But Eliza, even though she wants to become a nun and has turned to God, kind of like has no room to talk about anybody because she doesn't care about her mother. She's rude to her sister. She's just kind of a jerk person. So Jane says on 231, what? There you go. The fact was, I had other things to think about within the last few months. Feelings had been stirred in me so much more potent than they could raise. Pains and pleasures so much more acute and exquisite had been excited than any it was in their power to inflict or bestow. So basically, Jane is saying that she has bigger fish to fry. She's been concerned about Mr. Rochester this whole time, so what these girls think about her doesn't even matter anymore. It used to matter what Eliza and Georgiana thought of her, and now it doesn't any longer, and that's another instance of coming of age. There's also another example of coming of age on 232, third paragraph. The paragraph starts, well did I remember Mrs. Reed's face. It says, well did I remember Mrs. Reed's face, and I eagerly sought the familiar image. It is a happy thing that time quells the longings of vengeance and hushes the promptings of rage and aversion. I had left this woman in bitterness and hate, and I came back to her with no other emotion than a sort of ruth for her great suffering and strong yearning to forget and forgive all injuries, to be reconciled and clasped hands with amity. She comes back to Mrs. Reed, forgetting about all the hatred that she had. She now just wants to be reconciled because this woman is dying, and Jane sees that there's no purpose to hate her anymore. I know, there's no purpose to hate her anymore. And that kind of keeps going throughout this chapter. We learn on page 233 that, and Mrs. Reed doesn't realize she's talking to Jane because she's had a stroke, so she's kind of messed up. And we get the idea that Mrs. Reed always hated Jane's mother, who was Mr. Reed's sister, because Mr. Reed always bestowed a lot of attention on her. And that made Mrs. Reed very angry. And when he was so upset on page 234, right here, on page 234, he was so upset at the death of his sister, he would be beside himself and he would take care of Jane by himself. And then Mrs. Reed comments that, but he was weak, naturally weak, for being so bent out of shape that his sister died. Which one shows how cold Mrs. Reed is, and also shows how jealous she was at the time, and how family doesn't matter to her, but it mattered absolutely to her husband, Mr. Reed. And then on 235 and 236, Jane, she's asked to draw portraits of Eliza and Georgiana, and she also ends up drawing Mr. Rochester, and it kind of is reigniting that flame, that longing for him. Because again, we get the idea that Mr. Rochester is probably still going to marry Blanche, but we also get the idea that he does care for Jane, because when he was dressed as the gypsy, he told her to make a move, and she never did. So we know that he cares for her. He's just waiting for her to do something about it. And whether it's class, whether it's the fact that she's so much younger than him, she's just not willing to make a move yet. And then, of course, Mrs. Reed dies. Oh, bummer. We're so, bummed out about that. On page 238, Eliza turns to Georgiana and says, after my mother's death, I wash my hands of you. From the day her coffin is carried to the vaulting gateshead, you and I will be separate as if we had never known each other. You need not think that because we chance to be born of the same parents, I shall suffer you to fasten me down by even the feeblest claim. I can tell you this, if the whole human race, ourselves excepted, were swept away, we two stood alone on earth, I would leave you in the old world and betake myself to the new. And don't eat my mouse. Don't eat my mouse, please. Thank you. Here, with the sunglasses. There you go. what's important to note here is that this is a stark contrast between how Mr. Reed felt about his sister versus how his children feel about each other. And Jane even feels more strongly towards Adele and Mrs. Fairfax and Mr. Rochester than these girls who are blood related to each other. And this gives off the idea that blood relation doesn't matter. You choose the people in your family, according to Bronte. And that even could be a theme if you wanted to explore that in an essay. The theme could be something to the effect of blood relation, the importance of choosing one's family versus being born into family or something like that. Because there's a very clear sign of it right here at the bottom of this first paragraph on page 238. I know, it's right there. And down here in the second to last paragraph on 238, it's important to note. Yep. Don't eat the mouse. Thank you. It's important to note that because Eliza wanted to be a nun, Jane mentions, for in matters of religion she was a rigid formalist. No weather ever prevented the punctual discharge of what she considered to be her devotional duties. Fair or foul, she went to church thrice every Sunday. And as often on weekdays. Yeah. There were prayers. Yeah, prayers. Yay. Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah, Jane Eyre. Yeah, you tell them, kids. So what's important to understand is that Eliza, she's one of those people who goes to church all the time, no matter what, but isn't a good person. So she practices Christianity, but she doesn't practice being a Christian, if that makes sense. Because you're supposed to, when you're religious, people assume that you, don't eat my mouse, people assume that you're a good person. And Eliza equates being a good person, which is going to church every day and rigidly sticking to a religious regimen, which isn't the case. Here, you want that? Take that. There you go. It's a stamp. Okay. Let's see. This last page, or one of the last pages, 241. So second to last page in the chapter. Let go. Are you gonna help? You helping? So on page 251, or 241, excuse me, Mrs. Reed has her final conversation with Jane. She says, "You were born, I think, to be my torment. My last hour is racked by the recollection of a deed, which but for you..." You leaving? Okay, bye-bye. Thank you for your help. "I should never have been tempted to commit. If you could but be persuaded to think no more of it, Aunt, and regard with kindness and forgiveness." So Jane is trying to say, look, don't think about the bad things that have happened. I forgive you, forgive yourself, it's going to be fine. But her aunt won't do that. Her aunt just continues to insult her and tell her how much she hated her. So Mrs. Reed goes to her grave basically believing that she was victimized by Jane. So she says, "You have a very bad disposition," even though Jane's saying, "No, I forgive you. Let's sweep this under the rug. This is fine." And one to this day, I feel it impossible to understand how for 9 years you could be patient and quiescent under any treatment, and in the 10th break out all fire and violence. I can never comprehend. Mrs. Reed is still hanging on to what Jane said to her when Jane was 10 years old. It's been 8 years. Let it go, woman. Jane has come all of this way back to Gateshead Hall to forgive you, and you refuse to allow her to do that. She's just swimming in this self-pity that she can't get over. And she eventually then dies that way. And Jane says at the bottom of 241, "Love me then or hate me as you will," I said at last. "You have my full and free forgiveness. Ask now for God's and be at peace." Poor suffering woman. It was too late for her to make now the effort to change her habitual frame of mind. Living, she had never hated me. Dying, she must hate me still. Or she had never, yeah. So you want to make note of that because Jane gives her full forgiveness. Mrs. Reed can't hurt her anymore. The only person really we get the idea who can harm her is Mr. Rochester. So the fact that Mrs. Reed still hates her doesn't even mean anything to her anymore. She wanted as a child to have that maternal figure, which Mrs. Reed could never be for her. But now she's beyond it. She doesn't need it anymore. She's becoming her own person. So this is an example of coming of age. It's an example of proto-feminism because she doesn't need that acknowledgement from other women. She knows who she is and she's settled with who she is. Let's see. And Jane, on 242, the last page, the second to last paragraph in the chapter, Jane even says, only a grating anguish for her woes, not my loss, and a somber, tearless dismay, the fearfulness of death in such a form. So again, nobody, Georgia and Eliza are just the same as their mother. They only care about themselves. They don't care about anybody else. Yeah, they don't care about Jane. And then, of course, at the end, she leaves, and neither her nor Eliza drop a tear because Mrs. Reed was a horrible person, and even in death, she was not a good person. So those are the notes and kind of the summary for chapter 21. Still read it. There are still notes you're going to need to take, and if there's a quiz, there might be, you never know. You're going to actually need to read the chapter to pick up on all of those little plot points. However, I hope this did serve as some clarification for that chapter. It is a longer chapter, and then we're going to get her coming back to Thornfield at the end, okay? So if you guys got questions, you let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you Monday.